the participant to whom it may concern at the Baltimore Tribune. I will have you recall that on the 5th of April 2018, the renowned tech investor, Alexander B. Putnam, went missing while on a business trip to Seattle. The specific details regarding his disappearance, the few that I could gather, were murky and unsubstantiated at best. My own personal inquiries, which I believe I had a serious right to conduct, were met with resistance and subsequent legal threats from Mrs. Putnam and the local authorities. It is only in my last few months, with my own terminal diagnosis, that I see a need to fulfill my moral duty as an honorable upstanding member of this community. I must admit to the role that I believe I played in the disappearance and probable death of Mr. Putnam. Please print all of this letter, omit no part of it. This is my dying wish. My story begins with a phone call. In January of 2017, I took a call from Mr. Putnam. He explained to me that he wished to have an electrical system installed for a new guest house being constructed on his property. I asked him how big this guest house was, and he told me that it would be best if I come look at it in person. Please note that I was a sole proprietor master electrician at the time. I specialized in middle-class tract houses no larger than 3,000 square feet, and I made it my business to never bite off more than I could chew. On the day of our meeting I arrived at 10 a.m. sharp. I was admitted to the Putnams' compound by an armed guard who sat in a kiosk outside the front gate. At the moment of this admission into the Putnam compound, I was struck by the scope of Mr. Putnam's wealth and I wanted nothing to do with it. I have an aversion towards people with too much money. They tend to get bogged down in their own means and change a construction project's plans too often. Mr. Putnam met me in the foyer of his mansion. He was a pudgy man of 60 who wore a white Havana suit. I told him immediately that it was not likely that I would be interested in the job, as I was sure that his project would not match my professional tastes. He grinned at this comment and reassured me that he wanted only to show me the project and get my quote if it suited me. Next, Mr. Putnam brought me into the mansion's large kitchen where I met Mrs. Putnam. I'll note that Mrs. Putnam is a woman of extreme beauty. She immediately charmed me and thanked me profusely for coming to quote the job. She offered me a cup of coffee and produced a plate of donuts while Mr. Putnam proceeded to ask me about my family, and how my children were. To his question, I responded that I did not have a wife or children. In retrospect, I believe that Mr. Putnam was merely confirming facts that he already knew the answers to. Once the chit-chat was done, Mrs. Putnam gave her husband the approval to show me the guest house project. The guest house sat in the middle of the mansion's expansive hedge gardens. Unlike your traditional small house layout, it consisted of one large room and then a small bathroom. I was told by Mr. Putnam that the large room would be a massage salon. The square footage of the guest house was around 1,500 square feet. He said that the space would need adequate lighting and extra power for a few machines that would be installed for him and his wife's enjoyment. It was a bit too perfect when I think back on it. The building was just waiting there in an excellent position for me to begin my work. That is not the usual state I find things in. Usually there are numerous tradesmen working in frenzied unison on a building site, but it was apparent that all the other work had already been done. The plumbing was impeccable, the heating and air conditioning work was well done, and the framing was perfect. There was nothing left to do before the drywalling and tiling besides the electrical. Curiouser still, upon closer inspection, a trench had been dug between the main house's electrical panel and the guest house. And channels had been cut into the concrete foundation of the guest house floor for me to run floor plug lines. All of the preparatory work was done, and that type of preparatory work is not easy. After I had completed my initial inspection on that first day, I told Mr. Putnam I would present him with a quote by the week's end. He responded that a quote would not be necessary. He asked me what my hourly wage was. I told him my wage and he laughed. Mr. Putnam explained that he and Mrs. Putnam would pay me 4 times the amount I called my regular wage, plus a hefty completion bonus. I accepted the work on the spot. I had never been offered that much money in my life. It was a very generous offer, or so I thought. That first day, Mr. Putnam gave me a check for $10,000 as a partial advance on my work. After this check was handed to me, he pulled out a non-disclosure agreement which he assured me all of their property employees were required to sign. I signed the non-disclosure agreement with little thought, and I began my work on the Putnam Guest House the following Wednesday. The work at the Putnams was not difficult. I found it extremely simple and straightforward. I was given a lighting plan that had been designed by a high-end light designer. The lighting scheme was well thought out. The designer obviously understood electrical as some clearly do not, e.g. Mike Clements of Baltimore Lighting. All other aspects of the job were not on paper. Mr. Putnam relayed his wishes to have exactly 8 floor plug boxes evenly dispersed across the room, with each quad receptacle capable of handling for high voltage appliances. I initially thought this request was excessive, but in retrospect I see that Mr. Putnam was being thorough and prescient. Understandably, he gave me no more specifications. He did not wish to give me too much information too early in our relationship. I must mention a few things that I noticed before I continue with the progression of events that I believe led to Mr. Putnam's death. One was the strange quiet of the Putnam's estate. Besides the gate guard, I never saw another soul. The estate was many acres of meticulously maintained palatial gardens, and yet I never came across a gardener. Likewise, the mansion was many thousands of square feet, but I never saw a maid, cook, or help staff member enter or leave it. The last curious aspect of the job, which is not absolutely abnormal, but strikes me as noteworthy now, is the frequency with which I interacted with Mr. Putnam. For someone as wealthy and powerful as Mr. Putnam was, he seemed to take a genuine interest in me. Like clockwork, every other day of the work week, Mr. Putnam would come down with a cup of coffee for me at precisely 9 a.m. He would sit and chat with me for approximately 20 to 30 minutes every time. During these visits, we would talk about all manner of things: cars, stocks, women, macroeconomics, politics, etc. After many conversations with the man, I had a distinct sense that Mr. Putnam longed for deep connections with normal people. It took me 2.5 weeks to complete all rough-in work at the guest house. Once all the rough-in had been completed, I was asked to replace 2 chandeliers within the Putnam's mansion. I required help with the installation, and Mr. Putnam himself assisted me. As I worked in the house, I saw nothing out of the ordinary inside their home. It was a vast mansion, paneled in mahogany and full of dark chocolate-colored furniture. Once my jobs had been completed, I was handed a hefty completion bonus and offered a celebratory dinner with the Putnams. I accepted. During the celebratory dinner, the best wines the Putnams had in their cellar were brought out, and I found myself drunkenly arguing over the fact that my work in the guest house wasn't really complete until I finished the trim-out work. I was told by Mr. and Mrs. Putnam that my arguments were nonsense and that I would be a fool to not accept the bonus. To make matters even more congenial between us, the Putnams asked me if I would do them the honor of being their estate's retained electrician. I enthusiastically accepted, and I was presented with another check for tens of thousands of dollars. I left that dinner feeling warm, comfortable, and indebted to the Putnams. 2.5 weeks later, I received another call from Mr. Putnam. He informed me that the guest house was complete. I returned and finished the final trim out of the guest house, the plugs, switches, and light trims. I was relieved to finish that guest house project because the large amount of money I had received at the dinner party had sat a bit uneasy with me. Upon my departure that day, I was approached by Mr. Putnam and asked to come back the following week to help with the installation and assembly of a few of the machines that would be used in the guest house. I told him that I had very little experience with assembling machines, but that I would be happy to lend a hand. At this point he leaned in a bit and smiled at me. He told me that he and Mrs. Putnam did not believe that they could rely on anyone else. "Adam," he said, "I trust your ability and professionalism." His confidence in me deeply moved me. I was unconditionally at his service. I was given yet another check. As I left that day, I had an epiphany that I tried to hide from myself. I had cleared my entire schedule out and now had one employer, the Putnams. The first installation of the machines in the guest house went off without any difficulties. 2 large boxes sat waiting in the middle of the room for me on Monday. The boxes contained very high-end massage chairs from Norway. There were accompanying instruction manuals for both machines. The assembly took me 3 hours for each chair. They were no laughing matter. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. The chairs had large footholds that appeared to be thick leather bucket boots. Inside each boot resided 85 small suction cups, *, I read this in the manual, meant to deliver different pleasurable sensations to the participants' feet. I found that word, participant, in many of the manuals that I read. As for the chairs' seats, they were similar in design to the boots. For brevity's sake, I'll simply describe them as deep seats of suckers. I read in the manual that the machine's suckers possessed the ability to modulate themselves in waves, hills, and sharp declivities, to deliver calming sensations to the participants' appendages, digits, and posteriors. At first, it struck me as too intimate a detail to know the full purpose of the machine's features. One question that seemed to come to mind was, will Mr. and Mrs. Putnam hold hands while they are both having their butts massaged? When I finished the work, I found Mr. Putnam in his house. He thanked me and handed me my payment. He told me he would be in touch. This interaction was curt. I sensed that he may have been a tad embarrassed by the whole thing. I must make a point here, the checks that I kept receiving from the Putnams quickly outpaced the income one had made by my own business. I had much more money for leisure activities. I bought a nice motorcycle on a whim. The readers must know that the money that the Putnams gave me liberated me and simultaneously tethered me to them. If it was not for my new financial dependency on the Putnams, I doubt I would have endured what followed. The second round of machines were beds, thick plastic beds. Their upholstered sidings were made out of a dark cherry leather and their mattresses were a thick malleable plastic. As I read the manual for these beds, I saw that the beds were designed for many erotic sensations. At the end of the assembly of both beds, I took it upon myself to plug one in and observe its functions. I found the tamest feature in the manual and pushed the button that would deliver the moderate thrust. A large phallic shape appeared through the plastic mattress. It proceeded to appear and disappear, up and down. I immediately stopped the machine and unplugged it. That day I acted as normal as possible when I met Mr. Putnam. He wanted to talk about a new commercial rocket being designed for suborbital flight. I feigned extreme interest. I contemplated quitting then and there, but as he talked I realized how much I'd come to enjoy Mr. Putnam's company. I considered him a dear friend. It continued for several months like this. I stopped working as an electrician to assemble and install the various machines that Mr. and Mrs. Putnam saw fit to put in the guest house. I'd estimate that I installed a new machine once every 2 weeks. As I became more comfortable with the private specificity of the work, the exotic nature of the machines and their owners slowly emerged. I assembled and installed an animatronic horse with a phallic object that could be manipulated by remote control. I installed a rack that would splay a person out like a butterfly while stimulating him or her in private areas. I was also asked to mount chains and handcuffs to the room's wall. I must say that although I did not agree with, or share the sexual appetites of the Putnams, I made it my business to properly inspect and assess every single contraption I assembled for them. I saw it as a clear duty. I am a professional if nothing else. The incident that put me over the edge occurred after my Christmas vacation. 2 days before Christmas, Mrs. Putnam called me and scheduled a new machine installation for January 3rd. I arrived on the 3rd, and was admitted to the property without any issues. As I entered the guest house that day, an overpowering smell of bleach and cleaning supplies hit me. Usually, the room smelled of faint lavender. This particular day, the air was so pungent with chemicals, that I returned to my work truck to retrieve a respirator before I began the machine assembly. As I worked, it dawned on me that the only thing that warranted such a deep cleaning would have been a medical emergency. I stopped working. I got up and walked around the room, inspecting every machine and wooden floor panel as I went. The room was immaculate. Next, I went into the bathroom. The noxious fumes were worse in the bathroom. I noticed that the usual wastebasket in the corner had been replaced with a new one. I checked it, it was empty. Then I got down on my hands and knees and I looked at the tile floor. It was black tile, so it was very hard to discern anything upon its surface. I checked the edges of the room, where the tiles met the baseboard. In the corner by the toilet I came upon a splotch of something that stuck to the floor. It was no bigger than a dime. I took out my pocket knife and scrapped at it. It came loose easily. I picked it up and held it to the light. It was a speck of dried blood. At that moment, my stomach dropped and I had a sudden urge to barf. I pulled my respirator off and sucked in the bleached bathroom air. After I got a hold of myself, I flushed the blood speck down the toilet and completed my work as quickly as possible. As I left the property that day, the guard at the security kiosk handed me a check from the Putnams. He told me that Mr. Putnam regretted that he could not give me the check personally, but that he was dealing with urgent business. I left the property that day, sensing that something was profoundly off, and that I was playing a role in perpetuating it. 3 weeks later, I returned to the Putnams' estate under the pretense of installing another machine. Upon arrival at the Putnams, I called the residents from the security guard kiosk and requested that Mr. Putnam come down to the guest house for a talk. He agreed and apologized for not seeing me on my previous visit. When Mr. Putnam arrived, he appeared emaciated and pale, like he was recovering from something. His eyes were sunken with bags underneath them, and he had a heavy stubble on his face. I started in with my resignation right away. I told him that I would need to start working for myself again, and would not be able to continue working for him and his wife. I explained that the money was not sufficient to help me with my self-esteem. I simply could not feel good about myself if I continued to assemble machines and accessories for the purpose of human fondling. He told me that he understood, but that Mrs. Putnam may not. I asked him what he meant by this and he just frowned. "Please stay, Adam," he said, "just for my sake, to make sure that nothing is off with the machines." I looked deep into his face then, and what I saw clearly was a man deeply distressed. It was like I was talking to some sort of prisoner. I felt very bad for him, and so I told him that I would consider staying until they found a suitable replacement. This was a month before my last installation. When Mr. Putnam called me for the last time, he sounded in pain. "Adam," he said, "I need you to install one last machine for us in the guest house. Will you do it?" I paused at this request. I agreed as long as he was actively searching for a replacement. He claimed that he was. The last machine that I installed in that guest house was a large black booth full of rubber tentacles that sent low-voltage shocks to a participant's body, as he or she endured pulsating pokes delivered from a throne. It was horrible. It took me 15 hours to assemble, with one coffee break. Mr. Putnam brought me coffee at 9 p.m. and a little banter was exchanged. He asked me how the machine was looking. I told him point blank that I would advise him against using it. I felt that the rubber tentacles were poorly designed and that the low-voltage shocks to a sweating body could induce a cardiac arrest. I also told him that all the other machines in the guest house came from first-world countries. This was the one machine that was manufactured in Pakistan. I questioned the craftsmanship. The Pakistanis aren't known for their sex toys. He gave a very nervous laugh and told me not to be so closed-minded. He looked absolutely terrified. "It will be fine, Adam." These were his last words to me. I should have asked him so many questions before he walked away that day. I should have asked him if he needed help. I should have figured out if the machines were only being used by him while someone else watched him. I should have told him that I was concerned, and that I cared about his well-being, but I said nothing. I let him walk away. After I finished the assembly of the machine, I left the property. I never saw Mr. Putnam again. I was sent another large check in the mail the following week signed by him. A month later I heard about his disappearance. I didn't believe it for a second. It took me weeks to get in touch with Mrs. Putnam, and she refused to acknowledge any of my suspicions. I remain convinced that the machine that I assembled on my last visit to the Putnams' estate is responsible for Mr. Putnam's disappearance. I am so very sorry, Mr. Putnam.